Are resistance bands better than free weights? This sounds like a simple question, but it's kind of like asking if a hammer is better than a screwdriver. It depends on what your goals are and what you're trying to do with each of them. So first, we have to answer the question, better for what? One is not universally better than the other. Let's look at each tool at a foundational level so you can decide which one's better for you. There's nothing unique about free weights. They're just hunks of iron that you move, oftentimes against gravity, so your body can experience something new, break down, and recover better than before. But when we lift the free weight, let's say 10 pounds, you're not actually exerting 10 pounds of force against gravity. You're actually exerting much, much more. This is a bicep curl, if you couldn't already figure that out. Without getting too far into the mechanics, let's talk about direction of pull. Throughout the movement, the weight is always being pulled down and your muscle tendon is always pulling up with some slight deviation. Because your tendon is pulling in the opposite direction of the weight, there's little change to the force your muscle has to exert throughout the range of motion of a bicep curl. This is called an isotonic movement. Something useful to know is mechanical advantage. Your body is made up of levers, so when we're talking about weight, we have to talk about torque. Torque is the force, or the weight, times the perpendicular distance from the joint. Perpendicular to what? Perpendicular to the direction of the force. The green bar, which we'll call the resistance arm. You'll notice at the bottom of the movement, the resistance arm is shorter, providing a smaller torque. However, the distance of your tendon, seen in blue, which we'll call the force arm, also shrinks proportionally. If the two distances stay proportional and the weight doesn't change, there is no change in effort your muscle has to exert throughout the range of motion. However, that's just one example in one exercise. What if we took a different exercise, like a lateral raise? It's a common misconception that torque is responsible for a lateral raise being more difficult towards the top of the range of motion. You'll see that the proportion of the two arms stays relatively constant. Remember in a bicep curl where the force pulls in the opposite direction of the resistance? Well, here it pulls at a shear angle at the top. Because the muscle line of pull becomes more inefficient, the muscle has to exert more effort at the top to compensate for this inefficiency, even though the weight you're holding hasn't changed at all. There's also movements like squats. It would take a lot of time to dissect a squat mechanically, but the critical thing here is that the closer you get to 90 degrees of knee flexion, the greater overload of the quad muscles. There's a study I put in the description below that supports this statement if you're curious about reading more. So even though 10 pounds is 10 pounds, it might have a different effect on your muscle throughout the range of movement. We have isotonic movements like a bicep curl, moves that get more difficult towards the top like a lateral raise, and movements that get more difficult on the way down like a squat. Free weights also have a higher potential to develop momentum, which we'll talk about later. Unlike free weights, resistance bands do change resistance. They exert more force the more they're stretched. Even if you have a 10-pound resistance band, it doesn't mean it always pulls at 10 pounds. Sometimes it can pull with less, and sometimes it can pull with more, depending on the length. Remember that in a bicep curl with free weights, your muscle will work equally hard throughout the entire range of motion. With resistance bands, the maximum stretch, which promotes the highest resistance, is towards the top of the movement. This means that your muscle will work the hardest at the top and the rest of the movement won't be as difficult. But that's just one example. In our free weight lateral raise example, we said movement was the hardest at the top. And with our resistance bands, maximal tension will be at the top too. You can see how a free weight lateral raise and a resistance band lateral raise are very similar in terms of resisted force throughout the range of motion. I'll put a link in the description of a study that looks into this. The last exercise we talked about were squats. Free weight squats are more difficult towards the bottom and may be slightly better at quadricep overload, as that would be the dominant muscle activated at that point. Whereas resistance band squats get more difficult towards the top, where the glutes are more involved. Therefore, resistance band squats may serve to overload the glutes more effectively, all other things remain constant. One is not better than the other, they're just different. When comparing free weights and resistance bands, it's important to speak about what exercises you're doing, because as we saw, sometimes they're polar opposites, like a squat. Sometimes they're nearly identical, like a lateral raise, and sometimes they're just different in other ways, like a bicep curl. Another big difference is momentum. Every mass has inertia. Inertia is the tendency of an object to remain in its current state of movement. Free weights have much more mass and therefore more inertia, This makes it more difficult to start moving something compared to when it's already moving. Once you get your free weights moving, it now has momentum or inertia times the velocity of the object. Compared to resistance bands in a bicep curl, it'll be slightly easier to move 10 pounds from top to bottom because the weight's momentum wants it to continue on the path upwards. Yet it'll probably make it harder going down. Yet resistance bands are light and have less inertia. Less inertia means less momentum. Both free weights and resistance bands offer constant tension, but resistance bands are less susceptible to being aided by momentum since they're much lighter. In other words, resistance bands are less likely to help you out doing cheat reps, and they keep you more honest. There is a time and place for cheat reps though, just to put that out there. I can almost guarantee most people watching this are not high-level athletes, but I can imagine some do have athletic goals. When I talk about neurology, I'm talking about how the muscle tends to respond when asked to contract. The general rule of thumb is the exercise principle called SAID, or specific adaptations to impose demands. In other words, do what you want to get better at. If you want to get better at table tennis, then use a ping pong ball, not a bowling ball. However, there is some use in breaking down movements so you can become generally stronger or improve weak points in your activity. Most athletic sports involve short bursts of intense force. In other words, being explosive. We spoke about inertia and how it's hardest to get something moving initially. Well, this is more similar to most athletic scenarios you'll be in. You want to get you or an object moving quickly. In other words, you want the most force to be applied at the beginning of the move. Think about a juke in basketball or a block in football. You also want to make sure you remain forceful throughout the range of motion, not just the initial part. So resistance bands may be a good accessory, but free weights may be favorable in this sense because they'll train you to exert the most force when you need it most, at the beginning. On the other hand, if acceleration doesn't matter as much as end speed, say like in a baseball pitch or a javelin throw, resistance bands may be favorable. Bands typically require the most force at the end of the move, right before the ball or the javelin is released. The more force, the more speed, which turns to a faster pitch or a further throw. The last point I'll make is regarding the overload principle. This principle states you should exercise with more intensity than you're normally accustomed to. This is specific to each muscle. The bands you use for bicep curls are going to be really light for your legs, which are typically much stronger. This is more of a practical issue and can easily be overcome with some creativity, but something to think about nonetheless. Just try to work as hard as you feel comfortable with whatever implement you choose. So to sum up, are resistance bands better than free weights? Well, it depends, right? Better for what? I wouldn't want to overstate one versus the other because again, they're just tools in order for you to get to your goals. So thank you for watching. I hope this was somewhat helpful. And please subscribe if you want more long and drawn out answers to seemingly very simple and straightforward fitness questions.